What really happened with your host, Mike Rivero. The history the government hopes you never learn. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, hour number 3. The phone lines are closed right now, and joining us for this hour is Dr. Renee Dufault. And Renee used to work at the FDA. We put up the link to her website before. She's the author of a new book, Unsafe at Any Meal, and we did link from whatreallyhappened.com to the Amazon page where you can get your own copy. So thank you for spending time with us today, Dr. Dufault.
Thank you, Michael, for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Well, our listenership, our readership are obviously very concerned about all these stories about toxins in our food. We know that even before the acquisition by Amazon, Whole Foods had been hit with scandals of their products having chemicals you can't even imagine how they get into there. We know that Amazon got busted recently for selling a turmeric powder that had high quantities of lead, and you have to just sort of wonder what is going on with all of this stuff. So let's get into some questions here. You took early retirement in 2008 from the FDA, and you've just written and released the book now in 2017. Why did you write Unsafe at Any Meal now?
Well, what I did after I left the FDA was I started a nonprofit called Food Ingredient and Health Research Institute, and that is the platform under which I could continue the research so we could make sure that our findings were for real, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so it took a number of years, and the last clinical trial we did with college students at Fort Peck, Montana, we were able to find a direct connection between processed food consumption and blood inorganic mercury levels and fasting glucose levels, meaning the more processed food you eat, the higher your inorganic blood mercury levels and the higher your fasting glucose. So there's a direct link there to, type 2 diabetes, essentially. And so we needed some hard data. We already knew that there was heavy metals in the food supply, but you see these heavy metals are allowed to be in the food supply by federal law and international food safety laws. And the thinking up to this point has been, it's okay to have small exposures. But the thinking came from rat studies that were done many, many years ago before other substances were even on the market that we consume at the same time, for example, high fructose corn syrup. Even, so all these studies that upon which the current regulations are based were done before our diet changed to be what it is today.
Well, obviously.
So, go ahead.
I was going to say, well, obviously some new testing needs to be done, but we seem to be living in a situation where most of our government agencies are following the old adage, don't ask any questions you don't really want the answers to. And again, getting on back to this idea of mercury in your bloodstream, mercury can literally drive a person crazy. I'm sure if you're a big fan of Alice in Wonderland, you remember the character of the Mad Hatter. That was actually based on a real phenomenon because milliners used to use mercury to prepare the fur for the felting process for the hats, and exposure to it would drive them crazy. That's where that stereotype comes from. And many of these toxic substances, I presume, are cumulative, that once you get them in your body's not able to get rid of them. So over time, you can build up a very serious issue here.
Absolutely, especially if your diet is poor. So, if your diet is really good and you have lots of fruits and vegetables and very low exposures to pesticides, and once in a blue moon you have something that has inorganic mercury or lead, you can withstand that exposure. But if your diet is poor all the time, you're eating fast food, going to fast food restaurants, and eating a lot of processed food, then your body never has a chance to clear this stuff.
Okay, well, let's get on back to your book here. I'm sure I pretty much already know the answer to this, but what does the title of the book, Unsafe at Any Meal, mean?
It means that without educating yourself, if you eat the standard American diet, then you will become sick over time. That's why we have Western diseases, because Western diet leads to Western diseases. And now we know more than ever how this happens.
Well, certainly I know there's a lot of things in our food that we need to be cautious of. I'm at the very tail end of a major weight loss program. It's been 2 years, and I've lost pretty much 100 pounds now, and I'm getting down to my target weight. And I found out that one of the reasons earlier in life I couldn't lose weight is because of all the chemicals that are in our food that actually make you want to eat more, such as high fructose corn syrup, monosodium glutamate, aspartame, and so forth and so on. Now, obviously, for the food corporations, if they're finding materials to put in the food that make you eat more, then you will buy more and they make more money. But everyone's talking about America's obesity epidemic, and it's not a result of our lifestyle. It's a result of the chemicals that are in our food literally making us eat more. Now, when you do obesity studies on rats, you have to dose their food with monosodium glutamate, because normally rats will stop eating when they've had enough to eat. But if you dose them with monosodium glutamate, they will eat and eat and eat until they're on the verge of bursting. We have to take a second here to do a shout-out to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining our network. We're talking with Dr. Renee Dufault about her new book, Unsafe at Any Meal, and about the various chemicals that are in our food. And apparently in your book you talk a lot about the cost of pesticides, and we know that glyphosate has been declared a probable human carcinogen by the World Health Organization. And you make a parallel to Rachel Carson's watershed book, The Silent Spring, back in 1962, which pointed out how excessive use of DDT was leading to all kinds of problems in not only humans but in the biosphere as a whole.
Right. So what we have is, if you're talking about glyphosate, that's an organophosphate pesticide. And so we don't even know how much exposure to that we're getting, because they're not doing any glyphosate testing, and the USDA doesn't test for that in the food supply. You can go to their pesticide data webpage, and they have reports every year on what foods they're testing for which pesticides, and they're not looking for glyphosate. So we don't even know how much of that we're being exposed to. But we do know what you need to be able to metabolize and excrete glyphosate, and and we know what interferes with that metabolism. And so high fructose corn syrup will interfere. So will inorganic mercury. These two things alone will suppress the gene that needs to be turned on to produce an enzyme to break down glyphosate.
Oh boy!
And Americans are consuming, on average, I think they're consuming close to 27 pounds per year of high fructose corn syrup.
And that's nasty stuff. Nasty stuff.
Yeah, and so they're consuming 100 pounds of wheat, which is oftentimes contaminated with at least 2 different organophosphate pesticide chemicals, molecules. So, we're not eating what we need to eat to be able to metabolize and excrete the pesticides that we're getting.
Now, that's a real problem, and the problem is the glyphosate, they spray it on produce at the supermarket, just because it makes the produce last longer and there's less spoilage and less loss. They even spray it on non-food products for whatever reason, including women's feminine napkins, I understand, which is that's some of the thinnest tissue in your body that you can absorb that through. Anyway, let's get on back to your book and talk about the correlation between this increased exposure to chemicals and the development of disorders like Alzheimer's disease, dementia. We know there's a huge, huge out-of-control problem with autism, and that's been linked to mercury as well. And it almost seems like, I think you indicated that the higher the heavy metal levels in the blood of children, the greater their disability.
Absolutely. That's true.
Okay.
The higher the levels of inorganic mercury and lead, then the more autistic the child will be. The symptoms will be far greater.
Okay, well, let's, for the benefit of our listeners, what exactly do we mean when we talk about heavy metals and the reactive versus inert component?
Okay. Well, heavy metals, that just is, it just means that the element is denser. It will not float on water. For example, a lead weight in a fishing tackle box is solid and heavy compared to a styrofoam molecule. So heavy metal simply is referring to how dense they are and whether or not they'll float on water.
Okay.
Basically, that's what a heavy metal is. And so that we're talking lead, arsenic, cadmium, and mercury.
Well, all of these are definitely toxic and they're reactive to our chemistries. And you know, I have a question here that you just, where does this stuff come from? For example, high fructose corn syrup. How does mercury get into high fructose corn syrup? How does lead get into turmeric powder? And again, where is the FDA in all of this?
Well, in the case of high fructose corn syrup, mercuric chloride is added directly to the cornstarch during the processing. So at the front end of the process, they add mercuric chloride, and the reason why they add it is to stop the development of naturally occurring enzymes that are produced by the indigenous bacteria. So your cornstarch, it's going to have some bacteria on it that would produce enzymes that would degrade it over time and break it down. So to prevent the breakdown of the starch, they add the mercuric chloride because that's really toxic to single-celled organisms like bacteria. So it's added at the front end of the process, and then also the corn refiners they may not use it, but they can use mercury grade chloralkali products, which are like caustic soda or hydrogen chloride, and that's part of the recipe, if you will, to make the high fructose corn syrup. And if they use the chemicals, these two chemicals that are made using the mercury cell process, then you'll always have mercury residues. And in fact, when I worked at the FDA, I interviewed a corn syrup manufacturer, and I asked him what kind of caustic soda did he use in his process, and he said mercury cell. And I said, did you know that mercury cell caustic soda always has mercury residue? And he had no idea. So I think what's happened is we have these chemicals on the market, and there's only a couple of plants left in the United States, but that doesn't mean that they're not selling mercury-grade chloralkali chemicals in the U.S. because they import these chemicals. So we're getting them from somewhere. Mm-hmm. And the reason why they were using the mercury-grade chloralkali product to begin with, according to this manufacturer, was because it enhances the corn syrup shelf life, meaning the high fructose corn syrup will stay true to its form over time.
So they're basically using these mercury compounds as a preservative, like they use the mercury-based thimerosal in vaccines.
Absolutely. There's no doubt in my mind. In fact, the chlorine that's used to bleach flour has an allowable level of inorganic mercury. They know that they're going to use the mercury cell chlorine to bleach the flour, and so they know there's going to be some residue. And that prevents, by having that residue there, it prevents the development of mold in the flour. If you buy conventional flour and you put it on your shelf and you're in a humid environment, you're going to get mold. You won't get mold. There will be no mold because that flour will stay on the shelf forever. It's been chlorinated and it has pesticide residues, so you're not going to have any eggs hatching. But if you were to buy a bag of organic flour that is unbleached, you put it on a shelf in a humid environment, then you're going to get mold. So what I do with my organic flour is I put it in the refrigerator in a sealed plastic bag, and it stays good for as long as I need it to.
That's a good idea. Now that you're giving us these suggestions, next question is going to be, what advice are you going to offer to parents regarding the diet of their children and changes that would be beneficial?
Well, first of all, you want to avoid consumption of the high fructose corn syrup, all the corn sweeteners, and in my book I list them. And because there's other ones, there's maltodextrin, dextrose, there's a product line, in that same product line where they start with the cornstarch and apply mercuric chloride, you get a lot of different corn sweeteners. So you want to avoid those because you want to, the idea is to reduce inorganic mercury exposure. And then you want to avoid the vegetable oils, and I list those in my book as well, because there's a group out of Europe called FEDIOL, Fediol, and it's a manufacturing or a trade organization, and they wrote a report recently, like I think it was 2013, where they analyzed the risk for mercury contamination in the vegetable oils based on what they knew about their own processes. And so, the risk of inorganic mercury contamination in vegetable oil can be from anywhere from low, moderate to high. So you want to avoid vegetable oils, and you also want to avoid food colors because they have allowable levels. Some of there are some that are controlled more heavily by FDA than others. But they have allowable levels of lead, inorganic mercury, and arsenic, and these are certified food colors. And then there's also some food colors that are less regulated, and they have they also have, like, you might find them in organic processed foods. Annetto has allowable arsenic and lead, beta-carotene, allowable arsenic and lead, caramel, so in other words, they know, and through the manufacturing processes and the way they make these ingredients, they know there's a risk of having these contaminants, so that's why they have regulations with allowable levels. And then there's also preservatives like citric acid, carrageenan, that they also have allowable levels. So you want to pretty much avoid any processed foods, frankly.
Yes.
And then, you want to stick with the whole foods. And if you have oatmeal, then, get the oatmeal that just has oats on the box. And then, rather than the fast cooking one with all the other ingredients that you don't need.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the general rule Claire and I follow at the supermarket is if we can't pronounce it, we're not going to put it into our mouths. So let's get back to the issue of the food coloring. How is this going to impact the development of children? Because they like pretty things, they're going to eat the pretty things, and everybody likes coloring their food to where it doesn't look like food anymore.
Well, in the United Kingdom and European Union, some of these food colors are banned, and those that are still allowed, that have the allowable levels of some of the heavy metals, they have to have a label on the food products that contain them, with warning that it can cause hyperactivity in children. So, Europe has done their research, and most of the research actually came out of Europe that found the food colors to cause hyperactivity. So, and sodium benzoate does the same thing, by the way. It also has allowable heavy metals in it. So you want to, lead is very commonly found in elevated levels in children with hyperactivity. So you certainly want to avoid all the ingredients with allowable lead. And, you have to be strong as a parent, and when your child is wanting to have something that has food coloring in it, the best thing to do is to remove all the unhealthy foods from your kitchen cupboard.
Yes.
And just remove them from your kitchen, because you can control your own environment. It's harder when the kids are going to school and so forth, but at least you can control what your child gets at home.
Boy, I shudder to think what they were getting in those Michelle Obama school lunches in terms of processed food. Anyway, we need to take a 3-minute break for commercials. We'll be back with Dr. Dufault after these few words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're talking with Dr. Renee Dufault, and she's author of a book, Unsafe at Any Meal. You'll find the link to the Amazon page where you can buy it from my website, whatreallyhappened.com. And I'm already getting emails from people who are very impressed with your information, and so am I. I didn't know a lot of this material, and I'm probably going to get a copy of your book for myself and also for a family member who has a bunch of little tiny Kinters here. So, okay, the food color can cause hyperactivity, so can a lot of these other chemicals. Let's step back here to the issue of pesticides and what damage they can cause neurologically to both children and adults.
Well, pesticides have been linked to autism, Parkinson's, and heart disease, even diabetes. So pesticides, these are human studies, and this is what we know from the evidence. So how it happens, well, that we don't know. We don't understand well how pesticides damage the brain, and or how exposures lead to diabetes. That's, we don't know the hows. Mm-hmm. We just know that it does. In the case of high fructose corn syrup, we know through human studies, and actually a study done by USDA scientists, that it can lead to zinc loss. And so zinc is very important for the immune system.
Okay.
And we also know that when you're consuming products that expose you to inorganic mercury, we know that inorganic mercury displaces zinc, and in children who are hyperactive, they actually, when they consume food colors that have mercury in them, they will lose zinc in their urine. So if you're consuming products like high fructose corn syrup or food colors that lead to zinc loss, you are impairing your immune system. This is going to mean that you will start bioaccumulating the heavy metals. You won't be able to fend off the damage caused by pesticides.
Well, and again on the issue of pesticides, if you think about it, these are all intentionally poisonous compounds, and the idea is that somehow they're only going to harm the pests, but won't harm you all that much, and that would be a nice ideal. But it's like chemotherapy. We're designing it to go after the cancer, but yes, it's going to make you sick as well. So a certain amount of caution would be warranted. And one of the things that concerns me is, especially in the current day and age, how many products are simply rushed to market without adequate testing, without long-term studies. Certainly you probably are familiar with that French study on GMO corn and Roundup pesticide, the glyphosate, where the rats started getting these huge tumors after 4 months, which was just 1 month longer than Monsanto's own testing ran, where they said it's perfectly safe to use. And there does seem to be a tremendous politicalization of that checks and balances process, which I guess gets us to your difficulties with the FDA. Now, we're coming up here on another commercial break. When we come on back, though, I'd like you to tell our listeners the story of what you did at the FDA when you started finding these problems and how they reacted. But in the meantime, what are some of the more prominent pesticide residue-carrying foods that people might not be aware of?
That would be wheat, without a doubt. Yes, and the last reporting that was done by USDA was years ago, because they haven't reported publicly the pesticide residues in wheat and wheat flour for quite some time. But the fact is that the average American eats almost 100 pounds per year of wheat. And if they're eating conventional wheat, then they're getting organophosphate pesticide exposure, malathion, easily, because when that wheat is sitting in the silo, it can sit in the silo in storage for 5 years, and they will apply malathion repeatedly, as much as they need to make sure that grasshoppers and eggs don't hatch, or this is what's allowed. Whereas with organic flour, that flour has to be stored in refrigerators.
We're going to have to let you go. Not let you go. We're going to have to put you on hold. When we come on back, though, I want to hear about the FDA and how they treated you. We'll be right back. Aloha America, welcome back to the show. We're talking with Dr. Renee Default. We're talking about her book, Dangerous at Any Meal. And Renee, would you share with us the story of exactly what happened to you when you first uncovered this problem while you were working at the FDA?
Well, what I did was, it wasn't something I was looking to find. First of all, I was investigating the mercury cycle. Because when you, mercury pollution, whether it comes from coal-fired power plants or out wastewater from dental clinics, once it enters the water, then it ends up in the sediments of rivers and oceans, and it is then converted to methyl mercury, okay, which is what you find in fish. So someone asked me to put together a mercury cycle PowerPoint for a USGS conference. So, you know, I was just doing that. Well, when I was investigating the mercury cell chlor-alkali manufacturers, which these are the folks that make chlorine, and one way is to do it using mercury, I found out that mercury was always a residue in their products. And so then I started investigating, well, what is the biggest user of these products? And it turned out the high fructose corn syrup manufacturers were the biggest users of the caustic soda, the sodium hydroxide made from mercury. So then that's when I started investigating whether or not maybe there would be mercury in the high fructose corn syrup. And I was able to get a hold of some samples, and directly from the manufacturers. I actually sent out an FDA investigator to collect some. And then I had different laboratories analyze the samples, and they all found mercury in a certain percentage of them. So one of the collaborators was the University of California at Davis. Another one was Armed Forces Radiobiology Research Institute. So we went to the FDA Center for Food Safety Food Additives Group, and we presented our findings. And we also did a study between conventional foods with the first or second ingredient of high fructose corn syrup and organic foods. And so we also knew that the conventional foods had mercury residues more often than the organic ones. So we had a lot of data to share with them. Well, after that presentation, I was promptly told by the management over there at CFSAN, Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, that I needed to stop my investigation immediately. So anyway, I was in shock because I couldn't believe it, and I at the time didn't understand that you know, these mercury residues are expected to be in food products. I just didn't know that. It took me some time to get to the bottom of it, that it was actually allowed. So I ended up having to, I wasn't allowed to use the findings that we had that were generated by a federal lab. That was a different lab who ran some samples. So I had to essentially make arrangements to retire, and that's what I did. And that's how, you know, after I did that, I was able to follow up the research, and it took time. It took a number of years to get all the ducks in a row and to show the actual harm to humans. And so we now have the link between inorganic mercury exposure and fasting glucose levels, you know, leading to diabetes risk. So we've got that now. So now I could come out and say, yes, we need to fix this problem. So that's what happened.
Well, you know, of course, we're all familiar with the water crisis over in Flint, Michigan, where there are high levels of lead, and now it's turning out that our tap water all across the country is seriously contaminated. Our infrastructure is being allowed to crumble away here. We're going to take a quick phone call here. Tom in Utah, do you have a question for our guest? Tom?
Yes, Doctor. I'm the former pathologist or scientist that prepared Howard Lyman to go on Oprah Winfrey's show. I gifted him with my old name. I'm the vegan cowboy or vegan cowboy scientist. So I wanted you to expand on the problem that's created in the livestock industry with the organophosphates as well as these food additives actually that end up in animal feed.
I haven't studied animal feed, so I really, you know, I can only, you know, I don't know enough about that to really talk on it, to be honest with you.
Okay.
I don't know what the animals are getting. You know, I don't know what the exposures are.
Well, we know that...
For example, 700 pounds of fodder to produce 1 pound of finished cow, so that everything that's been treated with, with the pesticides ends up in there. But also, as I ran a dairy, I was giving my dairy herd foods that were processed, by IFA or the food processors, and there were food additives actually added, preservatives primarily, to the feed stock. So I try to educate people to the fact that when you're eating a piece of flesh or a glass of milk, you're getting a concentrated exposure to those issues, including the mercury.
Okay.
Well, I haven't studied that, so I really can't say anything on it. I'm sorry. I don't doubt you, but this is new to me. I haven't studied the perspective of what we feed the animals and then what those exposures might mean for us.
Well, Tom raises a very, very good point here, and you're, of course, being very responsible scientist by saying the things that you don't know, and so,
exactly.
that's a good thing as well. But, yeah, I mean, we know that a lot of the GMO corn that is being grown in this country is used for animal feed, and so there's the issue of glyphosate getting into their diet as well. And the real problem, of course, is that the pests are starting to evolve a tolerance to the glyphosate. So these farmers who are now contractually committed to having these seeds, they're having to go back to using the other pesticides as well. So, Tom, thank you very much for the phone call. We're going to let you go here, and you do raise a very, very good point. Along with all the growth hormones that are pumped into meat and poultry products as well. If they're not totally metabolized when the animal is harvested, that also winds up on your dinner plate. Now, getting back to you, Dr. Default, you have some very strong comments about the FDA and how it ought to be altered, I guess is a good word for it?
Right. Well, if I were in charge, which I'm not, but if anybody ever asked my opinion, I'd say we needed a whole new agency that only did food safety, and then we would take all that food safety responsibilities away from FDA and USDA, and then just, no one could work at this new food safety agency except for people that had never worked for any corporations involving food manufacturing or big agriculture. In other words, kind of a pure group of people who are not influenced by corporate America, and that their sole responsibility is to protect the public health. And that, another thing people don't know about FDA is that their job isn't to determine if a food ingredient is safe. That isn't their job. That was never their mandate. All that Congress ever allowed them to do from the beginning of its inception was to make sure that the labels on food products were true. In other words, that manufacturers were really truly putting in food products what it is that the labels said they were. So that's what FDA does. And by law, the food manufacturers have the responsibility to determine if a food ingredient is safe. So what we have is a situation where the food ingredient producers say whether or not they're safe or not, and FDA accepts that.
So there's
something wrong with that picture.
Yeah, there's no enforcement there, and I understand that for ingredients in, for example, processed food below a certain minimum, the manufacturers are not required to put those on the label. That a given material has to be a certain percentage before it goes on that list. And we know that food labeling can be very dishonest. And again, getting on back to monosodium glutamate, a lot of people try and avoid it. It does make you want to eat more. For many people, such as yours truly, it's also a migraine trigger. So I'm always reading labels, watching out for MSG, monosodium glutamate, but because food manufacturers want you to eat it so that you eat more food and they make more money, they have all these euphemisms out there, like hydrolyzed yeast protein and all these other, I think there's something like 30 different names that all mean added MSG.
And there is a allowable lead in MSG, up to 1 parts per million, just to give you a heads up on that.
Okay. All right, so you dedicated your new book to your children, grandchildren, and the next generation. Why exactly did you do that?
I did that because the children are our future. That is our legacy, is our children. And what we eat today as parents is going to color their health in the future. Whatever we eat is going to determine how healthy our children are. And this is the study of how our genes are passed on from one generation to the next, and how even our metabolism is passed on. How our genes work is passed on from one generation to the next. This is all new. This new field of epigenetics, how what we eat determines how our genes behave, is a new field. And I wanted to dedicate the book to the children because it's important for parents to understand that what they eat today is going to determine the health outcomes tomorrow of their children and grandchildren. So whatever a pregnant woman eats and drinks is going to determine whether or not her child is born with a neurodevelopmental disorder, or if the child will develop type 2 diabetes or even heart disease. Well, now, we do know that... Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Well, a child diagnosed with autism or ADHD can lose their diagnosis by making healthy dietary changes. So, this is a fact. And that's why I'm dedicating the book to the children, grandchildren, and the next generation.
Well, one thing that's...
And I want to add, I'm sorry,
but
we do have a free online tutorial that goes with the book. So for every chapter in the book, there's a module of instruction with video, kitchen cupboards activities, and so on, and discussion questions. So you could put together a group of people and everyone reads the book together and then do the weekly discussion questions and so on, and come out of it with a whole new attitude and a whole new lifestyle.
Well, as I was going to say before, we know that medical care in the United States is the most expensive in the world, but it's not a very good quality. And the reality is that Americans' overall health does seem to be in decline. More and more people just seem to have all these chronic issues. They've got lots and lots of little bottles in their medicine cabinet. We know that life expectancy for the American people is actually in decline at the moment. And so we need to look at this issue. Where is this all coming from? And then you find out that there are chemicals in your food and in your medicines which are not really what's best for you. They're merely economically advantageous for the manufacturer or the processor. And so it's a little bit scary that you can't trust what's going on in the supermarket. And I know a lot of people used to go to Whole Foods. They had a couple of bad scandals there, but now that Amazon's taking it over, they've already said they're going to get the cheapest products they can get to compete with Walmart, and that means back to the processed, chemical-laden, pesticide-dripped stuff. And personally, Claire and I, Claire's a wonderful cook, and we go to the local farmer market, and we get produce, and we understand we have to use it up real quick or it's going to go bad. But we're trying to avoid all of that chemical stuff because, again, I came to understand that was a big reason why I couldn't lose weight before, was all these chemicals that were in there. Now, if readers of Unsafe at Any Meal want to achieve a healthier way of living, what's the most important piece of information they should take away from the book?
Well, all they need to know is that everyone can benefit and feel better by making the healthy dietary changes I recommend in Unsafe at Any Meal. If you're sick, no matter what your diagnosis, making healthy dietary changes will improve your quality of life. And if you're healthy, you can stay healthy by switching to a healthy diet.
All righty. Well, obviously, again, the link, I have a link from whatreallyhappened.com to the page at amazon.com where you can purchase Unsafe at Any Meal. And like I said, I'm going to get a copy for myself and a copy for a relative who's a doctor with bunches of little kids roaming around here. And it almost seems like concern for overall health of the American people has been sacrificed on the altar of corporate profitability. And that is just absolutely a nightmare scenario, that the only thing that we mean to these corporate CEOs is we have wallets and we're willing to spend money. And again, if these chemicals in the food are making you ill, well, you go off to the doctor, you get more medicines, spend more money. It's like a racket going on. We're going to take one more phone call here. Sherry in Kansas, aloha. Do you have a question for our guest?
Yes.
Yes, this is Sherry. By the way, technically glyphosate is an herbicide. And this year, Dr. Stephanie Seneff and Anthony Samsel came out with a paper. They're saying that glyphosate is actually plugging in where your body might use glycine. Have you seen this?
I have not read that paper. I have read other papers that by that team, but I have not read this one.
Yeah, it's on the Western A. Price Foundation.org, and it's, to me, this is very serious because your body uses glycine in a lot of places, and it's in their paper. They're saying that connective tissue, which your body is like 25% connective tissue, and glycine's used a lot in there. It's used in our DNA strands. And I mean, this is really serious. And they're saying
it sounds like just one more potential pathway of disease. We have knowledge now of several different pathways.
Yeah. Well, you ought to look into that because, to me, they said that gelatin, glycine's in gelatin, and that they grow the measles vaccine or the measles virus in gelatin. And they have an interesting bill in there at the end of the paper where they say that, they compare before 2003 and after 2003, and because, glyphosate wasn't used.
Okay, Sherry, we're going to have to let you go. We've got to take another break for commercials. Thank you very much for the phone call, and we'll be back with Dr. Renee Default for the last segment of our program today. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, last segment of our program today here. And I'm actually getting a lot of email. Apparently, it came as a shock to a lot of people that the FDA's authority is just making sure the labels are accurate rather than the safety of the food itself. And again, relying on the corporations to be honest about their products. We know many times when the corporate supplied research has been rigged. Anyway, we have about 4 minutes left here, and again, Renee's book is called Dangerous at Any Meal. The Amazon link is on whatreallyhappened.com. Renee, is there anything else you want to share with our listeners?
Yeah, actually it's unsafe at any meal, what the FDA does not want you to know about the foods you eat. And I do want the listeners to know we have a free online tutorial that goes with the book at the foodingredient.info website, and it's at the tabs are at the top, the menu, so you push the button that says Healthy Diet Tutorial. So we've already tested the content in 3 clinical trials, and in each trial, the participants, the human subjects, if you will, the human beings who participated, they did, in fact, switch to a healthy diet. So it's very important that people are able to get education in a way that makes sense to them. So we have all kinds of activities and movies and so forth that appeals to all learning styles. So I would encourage folks to not only get the book, but also have their friends or family members work with them in a book study group and go through the tutorial, because I think they'll find it very effective in helping them actually make those behavior changes.
Can you give me the URL again?
It's www.foodingredient.info.
Okay. All right. I'm going to put a link to that from whatreallyhappened.com right now so that people can take a look at that. Well, it's been an eye-opening interview. I learned an awful lot here that I was unaware of, and judging by the email, so did a lot of other people. And this is an area of concern where we literally should be very distrusting of the products being put out by food and medical corporations. And you were talking about, the caller was talking about how glyphosate may fit into the receptor sockets for glycine, and that's been a big problem with GMO in general because of malformed proteins that are fitting into receptors in your body, and they don't quite fit, and you can get illnesses resulting from that as well. So it's a big issue, and you have a lot of courage for leaving your position at the FDA and starting this foundation of yours and continuing the work, because it is very, very important. And again, I had no idea that some of this stuff was out there, and I'm definitely going to be getting 2 copies of your book as soon as we sign off the radio show. So, Dr. Default, thank you very much for being with us today, and I think somewhere down the road we're probably going to have you back again, because this is important stuff. All right,
Thank you, Michael.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. There's the music. It's time for us to get on out of here. I have another thing I need to be doing here very soon. We'll be back tomorrow here on the Republic Broadcasting Network. Please take what you learn here, share it with everyone that you know. We need to get this information out. We'll be back tomorrow. Aloha, America.